Have you ever wondered, what if the part of yourself you're most afraid of, the one you hide, deny, or try to fix, is actually the key to everything you're searching for? Not the polished version of yourself you show the world, not your goals, your habits, or your social identity, but the anger, the insecurity, the jealousy, the obsession, the part you try to silence. What if that darkness isn't the enemy, but the message? Carl Jung believed that the true self isn't found through perfection, success, or positivity. It's uncovered through confrontation, through facing the part of yourself you've spent your whole life trying to escape. And according to Jung, that part has a name: the shadow. The shadow is everything within you that you've disowned, repressed, or rejected. But unlike a monster you can lock in a closet, the shadow doesn't disappear. It hides. It waits. And then, at the worst possible moment, it hijacks your thoughts, your behavior, your life, not because it wants to ruin you, but because it's trying to be seen. You see, most people search for purpose in clarity. They journal, they read, they follow motivational gurus, all trying to find themselves in something clean, safe, and uplifting. But Jung said something very different and much harder to hear. He believed your purpose isn't found by looking up, but by looking down. Not in the light, but in the darkness. Because buried in that darkness is the part of yourself that's never been allowed to speak, and it holds your story, your truth, your pain, and your power. Why do we so often feel lost, disconnected, or like we're living someone else's life? It's because we've built that life on only half of who we are, the acceptable half, the socially approved mask, the curated version. But what about the rest? What about the messy, raw, wild part of you that keeps screaming from beneath the surface? This is not a flaw in the human psyche, it's a map. A map that leads to the very thing you're missing: authenticity, meaning, purpose. But most people will never follow it, because to follow it, you have to turn around and face the part of yourself that hurts. You have to ask, why do I react this way? Why does this fear control me? What have I buried so deeply that I've forgotten it was even mine? Jung didn't believe we were broken. He believed we were divided, and to become whole, we must reunite with the part of ourselves we've been taught to fear. Only then can we understand what we were truly meant to become. But what exactly is this shadow, and why does it hold such dangerous power over your life? Let's go deeper. There is a part of you that you were trained to deny before you even understood it. It began when you were a child. Maybe you were told not to be angry, not to cry so much, not to speak out of turn, not to want too much. And slowly, without even realizing it, you began to bury those parts of yourself just to be accepted, just to feel safe. That buried part is what Carl Jung called the shadow. It is not evil, it is not toxic, it is simply the collection of everything you were told you shouldn't be. Anger, fear, desire, sadness, even creativity, assertiveness, and brilliance can become shadow traits, depending on the environment you grew up in. But here's the catch. Just because you push it away doesn't mean it disappears. It just moves underground into your unconscious and begins to run the show from there. The shadow influences your choices, reactions, relationships. It leaks out through sarcasm, addiction, passive aggression, depression, jealousy, resentment. You think you're in control, but in reality, your rejected self is calling the shots. Have you ever exploded at something small and didn't know why? Have you ever disliked someone instantly, even though they didn't do anything wrong? That's projection. One of the shadow's favorite games. You see in others what you refuse to see in yourself. You reject the arrogant person because you fear your own need for recognition. You resent the emotional person because you've buried your own sensitivity. You envy the bold because you've silenced your courage. This is the tragedy of disowning the shadow. We don't eliminate it, we externalize it, and it starts running our lives from the background. But it goes even further, because the shadow doesn't just contain darkness, it also contains buried power, talents you were told to suppress, desires you never let yourself feel, insights that were too painful to look at. This is why ignoring the shadow doesn't make life better. It makes it smaller, flatter, less alive. The more you reject the shadow, the more you become a stranger to yourself. You begin to live a life that looks right on the outside but feels wrong on the inside. You say yes when you mean no. You smile when you feel anger. You perform instead of exist. And that's the real reason so many people feel lost. It's not because they're broken, it's because they're incomplete. Jung understood that wholeness does not come from light alone. It comes from integration, from bringing the lost parts home. But here's where things get strange, because your shadow isn't just trying to ruin you, it's trying to wake you up. So what if it's not a curse at all, but a message in disguise? Let's find out. Most people believe their darkness is something to suppress, contain, or eliminate. But Jung's most revolutionary idea was this: the shadow is not here to destroy you. It's here to guide you. In fact, it might be the only part of you that still remembers who you really are. You see, the shadow doesn't lie, it doesn't perform, it doesn't try to impress anyone. It holds the raw, unfiltered data of your soul, the parts of you that were silenced not because they were wrong, but because they were too real for the world around you. And what happens when you stop running from that darkness and instead ask what it wants to show you? That's when everything changes. Jung studied mythology not just as story, but as coded truth. In every myth, the hero doesn't find their power by staying safe. They find it by entering the underworld. Think of Orpheus, who descends into Hades to reclaim his lost love. Think of Inanna, stripped of her jewels and titles, forced to face her shadow in the depths. Or think of Luke Skywalker, confronting Darth Vader, not just his enemy, but the reflection of what he himself could become. These aren't just stories, they're maps of the human psyche. And Jung realized that your shadow is the gatekeeper to your purpose. Not your fake purpose, the one based on titles, applause, or achievements, but the deeper one, the one your soul came here to live. Because here's the secret no one tells you. The wound and the gift are right next to each other. The pain you've tried to hide is the very place your real strength lives. The sensitivity you were told to bury might hold your empathy. The rage you've suppressed could fuel your ability to protect others. The insecurity you carry may be the key to your compassion. But none of this can be accessed if you keep the door closed. Facing the shadow is terrifying. It means admitting that you've betrayed yourself. It means seeing the masks you wear, the games you play, the truths you've ignored. But it also means reclaiming the pieces of yourself that were never truly lost, only exiled. And when you begin to do that, you realize something wild. Your shadow isn't just a reflection of your past, it's pointing toward your future. It's a compass made of everything you've refused to look at. So if the shadow is trying to show you something, what exactly is it pointing toward? The answer might change your life if you're brave enough to look. If something is awakening in you as you listen, you're already part of the few. Subscribe now and stay close to the journey. Thank you for being here. There's a strange pattern you'll notice if you look closely at the lives of those who truly changed the world. Artists, thinkers, visionaries, even revolutionaries. Almost without exception, their purpose wasn't born out of clarity, success, or ease. It was born out of pain. And not just any pain, but the kind they were forced to feel over and over until it demanded a response. That response became their gift, their work, their truth. Carl Jung saw this connection before most psychologists dared to. He believed that your unlived life, the parts you rejected, feared, or buried, doesn't just disappear. It waits. And the longer it waits, the louder it cries out in the form of anxiety, depression, anger, or numbness. But beneath those symptoms lies something else, a secret direction. Ask yourself, what parts of yourself have you always been told to suppress? What makes you too much or not enough? Is it your sensitivity, your intensity, your ambition, your unconventional ideas? These are not flaws. These are encrypted signals. They're clues to what you're here to embody, and they often live in the shadow. Take the person who was shamed for being too angry. Maybe that anger, when integrated, becomes righteous power, a force for justice or protection, or the one who was silenced for being too dramatic, who turns that deep emotional range into world-shifting art. Or the child who was made to feel guilty for wanting to lead, who now hides their gift for vision beneath false humility. Jung called this the process of individuation, the journey of becoming who you really are by reuniting with the parts of yourself you abandoned. Not by copying someone else's path, but by translating your personal suffering into a universal offering. Here's a metaphor. Imagine an artist who refuses to use dark colors. Their paintings might be pretty, but never powerful. The darkness gives contrast, meaning emotion. It holds weight. The same is true of your life. Without integrating your darker hues, your purpose will remain shallow, fragmented, performative. Beautiful maybe, but never whole. And yet, despite this hidden connection between pain and purpose, most people spend their lives trying to avoid discomfort. Why? Why do we run from the very thing that might hold our liberation? That's because the shadow is not just painful, it's terrifying. And the moment you start moving toward it, your ego sounds the alarm. It tells you you're in danger, that you'll be rejected, that you'll fall apart. But is that really true? Or is it just the fear of transformation doing what it always does, keeping you exactly where you are? Because if the shadow holds so much potential, why do so many people run from it? The answer isn't just emotional, it's psychological, and it's one of the oldest defense mechanisms in the human mind. Why do we run from our own shadow, even when we suspect it holds something important, something vital? The answer isn't just fear. It's a centuries-old system of psychological defense, one designed not to protect your growth, but to preserve your comfort. And comfort, as Jung knew, is often the greatest enemy of transformation. From the moment we're born, we begin absorbing unspoken messages about who we're allowed to be. Don't be angry. Don't be too loud. Stop crying. You're being dramatic. These are not just words. They're instructions. And your young mind, desperate to belong, follows them perfectly. You cut off pieces of yourself just to feel safe, just to be accepted, just to be loved. But here's what happens. Everything you suppress doesn't vanish. It simply moves underground, into the unconscious. It becomes the shadow, the unclaimed self. And over time, it builds pressure. A pressure that leaks out in ways you can't control. Sarcasm, sudden rage, depression, sabotage. And every time it emerges, you feel guilt or shame, which only pushes it deeper. This is the psychological trap, the loop of repression, reaction, and regret. Jung called it the return of the repressed. What you avoid will revisit you. What you disown will own you. And the more you resist the shadow, the more power it gains. But that's not all. There's another reason people fear the shadow, projection. When you can't face a trait in yourself, you project it onto others. You hate the arrogance in someone else because it mirrors the confidence you've buried. You resent another's freedom because it reminds you of your own suppressed desire. The shadow, when ignored, becomes a weapon, not just against yourself, but against the people closest to you. This is why self-righteous people are often full of unresolved darkness, why moral panic often hides private shame, and why those who cry loudest for control are often terrified of their own chaos. But projection has a price. It keeps you blind. It convinces you that the problem is always out there, so you never look in. You never see what's truly asking to be healed. And then there's the ego, that master illusionist that tells you, you're fine, you're normal, you've already healed. The ego isn't evil. It's scared. It fears annihilation. Because integrating the shadow requires you to admit that you're not who you pretended to be, that the mask you've worn for decades is not your face. So it fights back, with distraction, with judgment, with perfectionism, anything to avoid the truth. And yet, no one escapes this reckoning forever. At some point, through heartbreak, failure, or sheer exhaustion, the shadow demands to be seen. So the question is no longer, should I do shadow work? The real question is, how long will I keep running from myself? Because sooner or later, the only way out is in, and that leads us to the beginning of real transformation. But where do you start, practically, emotionally, and spiritually, when facing the parts of yourself you've feared for a lifetime? So how do you begin to face the very parts of yourself you've spent a lifetime running from? It starts, not with grand revelations, but with quiet, honest observation. Jung famously said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Shadow work is how we interrupt that fate, how we begin to take back authorship of our own story. And the very first step is awareness. Start with your emotional triggers. Those moments when your reaction is stronger than the situation warrants, anger that flares suddenly, jealousy that bites too hard, sadness that feels strangely familiar. These are not random, they are signals, the shadow knocking at your door. Ask yourself, what part of me feels threatened? What am I defending right now? Next, notice your projections. When you find yourself irrationally annoyed or deeply moved by someone else's behavior, stop, reflect. Could this be a part of yourself you've exiled? That impulsive friend who frustrates you, is it because you've buried your own spontaneity? That confident speaker you secretly envy, do they embody a boldness you've disowned? Don't judge the answers, just observe, then begin to journal. Not about what you did today, but about what moved you emotionally and why. Write when you're angry, when you're ashamed, when you're hurt. These moments are gold in shadow work. They're raw, real, and reveal the fractures in your inner architecture. Over time, you'll see patterns, recurring fears, recurring voices. These are the outlines of your unconscious mind, surfacing for the first time. But awareness is only the beginning. Shadow work demands expression. This doesn't mean acting out the shadow, it means giving it space to speak. This could be through art, dance, private voice recordings, or therapy. You're not trying to fix these parts. You're trying to meet them. You're trying to hear what they've been trying to say, sometimes for years. The angry child, the silenced artist, the terrified teenager, they're all in there, and they're not your enemies. They are you, just frozen in time. When you create space for them, something strange begins to happen. You soften, you expand. The people who once triggered you lose their power. The emotions that once controlled you become guideposts. And for the first time, your reactions start to feel like choices. But here's the truth. Shadow work is not neat, it's not linear. You will lose your bearings, you will feel resistance, you will grieve for who you could have been if you'd started sooner. And that's okay, because every great transformation begins in chaos. The goal is not to heal everything at once, but to show up over and over with honesty. But don't be fooled, this work is sacred. And it changes more than just your inner world, because when the shadow begins to integrate, your relationships, your creativity, your very sense of identity begins to shift in ways you never imagined. Shadow work does not end at personal healing. Once the unconscious begins to rise into awareness, it touches everything. How you love, how you create, how you show up in the world. And this is where the transformation becomes visible. Take relationships. When you ignore your shadow, you unconsciously seek people who either reflect it or help you avoid it. You chase unavailable partners because deep down, you're afraid of intimacy. You sabotage friendships because closeness brings up fear of abandonment. You overgive, over-apologize, or withdraw entirely, not because of others, but because parts of you were never accepted, even by yourself. But once those rejected parts begin to return, your relationships evolve. You stop needing others to complete you or validate you. You start setting boundaries not out of fear, but from inner alignment. and something unexpected happens. You begin to attract people who recognize your wholeness, not your wounds. And then there's creativity. Jung believed that creativity was a natural byproduct of individuation, the journey of becoming fully oneself. Why? Because your shadow contains suppressed energy, repressed ideas, unspoken truths. And when you bring them to light, that energy floods into your voice, your writing, your art, your leadership. You stop imitating others and begin creating from something ancient and original within you. Think of Frida Kahlo. Her paintings didn't come from perfection. They came from pain, from a broken body, a fractured heart, a shadow fully seen and painted in color. Or consider Martin Luther King Jr. His power wasn't just rhetorical. It came from confronting the rage, grief, and despair of his generation and transforming it into vision, compassion, and unshakable purpose. This is what shadow work can give you. Not just relief, but revelation. Suddenly, the things you once hated about yourself, the sensitivity, the fire, the strange contradictions become sacred. You begin to understand why you never fit in, why you always felt a little different. You weren't broken, you were buried, and now, piece by piece, you're coming home to yourself. But this homecoming has another dimension, one Jung believed was not just psychological, but spiritual. Because when one person dares to embrace their shadow, they don't just heal themselves. They begin to heal something much larger. They begin to shift the collective, change the culture, break generational patterns. But how? How does one person's inner work ripple out into the world? That's where we're headed next, to the secret Jung saw at the center of human transformation. Carl Jung did not believe shadow work was just personal therapy. He believed it was a moral responsibility, a form of psychological alchemy with the power to change not only the individual, but the entire world. Why? Because unexamined shadows don't just hurt you, they leak out into society, into politics, into religion, into war. When you deny your own aggression, you project it onto the other. When you suppress your pain, you punish those who reflect it back to you. Families break, nations divide, violence multiplies, all because people refuse to face themselves. Jung called this the collective shadow, the sum total of what humanity has buried, denied, and refused to integrate. And he warned, what is not made conscious will be lived out as fate, not just individually, but globally. But here's the miracle. When one person dares to go within, they interrupt this cycle. They stop the projection. They own what they used to blame. They reclaim the rage they put on others, the shame they tried to erase, the fear they masked as pride. And by doing so, they become clear, they become responsible, they become real. Imagine a society where people no longer perform virtue to avoid guilt, where leaders no longer pretend perfection to avoid judgment, where families talk openly about the feelings they once feared. This is not fantasy. It begins every time a single person says, I am willing to look. It begins when someone refuses to scapegoat, even when it's easy. When someone admits their jealousy instead of disguising it. When someone forgives a parent not because they should, but because they finally understand their own wounds. These choices ripple. They interrupt generational pain. They stop trauma from being passed forward like an inheritance of silence. This is the deepest gift of shadow work. It breaks the unconscious spell cast over humanity, the spell that says, I am fine. It's everyone else who's broken. No, the truth is we all carry a shadow, and the more we deny it, the more it controls us. But the more we face it, the more light we bring into the world. This is what Jung meant when he said that individuation, the process of becoming your whole self, is not just for you. It is for the entire human psyche. It is the only way to truly evolve. And now the question turns inward. Will you live this truth, not as an idea, but as a way of life? Because there is one final message from the shadow, and it may change how you see everything from this moment forward. Here is the truth most people spend their entire lives avoiding, not because it's hidden, but because it's too close to see. Your purpose, your clarity, your strength, they're not somewhere outside of you waiting to be found. They are locked inside the very thing you've spent years trying to avoid. The anger you repress, the envy you deny, the fear you silence, the desire you shame, that is the path. Carl Jung believed that every human being carries a deep blueprint within, a unique expression of the self, waiting to emerge. But it cannot emerge through pretending. It cannot emerge through perfection. It can only awaken through confrontation with the shadow. And here's what that means. Your healing is not in becoming someone else. It's in reclaiming who you always were before the world told you what to be. You don't need to destroy your shadow. You need to integrate it, to dialogue with it, to realize that it is not evil. It is unlived life. It holds the fire you thought you weren't allowed to feel, the boundaries you were never taught to hold, the power you were told to fear. When you say, "This is who I am," all of it, something changes. The lies fall away, the masks dissolve. You stop chasing approval and start standing in your own gravity. And it's in that moment, not after decades of chasing success or enlightenment, but right there, in that honest moment of wholeness, that you begin to live. Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." That privilege is earned through shadow work, through looking where others refuse to look, through listening to what you were taught to ignore, through facing yourself fully, without shame, without justification, without escape. So look at the thing you fear, the pattern you keep repeating, the part of you you've buried. That is your first step forward. And now, if something stirred inside you during this journey, if you feel even the faintest spark of recognition, of courage, of clarity, then you're already on the path. You are already becoming whole. You don't need to be fearless. You need to be honest. If this journey helped you see something new in yourself, share it below. Your insight might help someone else begin their own transformation. Write the words, "I see my shadow, I am ready." And if you're ready to keep diving deeper, the next video will take you even further into mastering yourself and freeing your soul completely. See you there.